how many times has life on Earth already stood on the edge of total destruction? For decades, this subject has held both paleontologists and historians in suspense. Although geological and genetic evidence suggests that the planet has survived at least 6 global catastrophes powerful enough to reshape the biosphere, mainstream science often treats them as separate tragedies. But what if these apocalypses were not only endings, but points of reset? If so, what was born from the ruins of the old world? Are we the legacy of those who survived? And finally, what will happen when the cycle repeats again? We will discover this together in this episode. Welcome. 66 million years ago, an impact in the shallow sea near modern-day Chicxulub ended a world. A scar wider than a small country, now buried beneath limestone, is all that remains of the event that erased the dominant life on this planet. 23,000 years ago, a person walked across the wet mud of an Ice Age lakebed in what is now New Mexico, leaving footprints that would survive through the ages. And in the thousands of years that followed, as the great ice sheets retreated, the oceans rose and swallowed an entire world of coastlines, landscapes where people almost certainly lived, and where their traces may still lie beneath the waves. A crater, a footprint, a drowned shore. These are not just relics of the past, they are fragments of a broken archive. We often imagine history as a library, a place where the records of the past are waiting to be read. But what if that library has burned down more than once? What if catastrophe does not only destroy life, but also deletes memory? What if it leaves behind only a few scattered pages, with the rest of the book missing forever? This investigation follows those fragments, from impact craters to ancient ash, from rising seas to buried footprints, from stone tools to drowned landscapes, to explore a different kind of apocalypse. Not only the end of a world, but the erasure of what that world knew. Because the central question is not only what happened during these great cataclysms, the deeper question is what they may have erased from the human story before we ever learned how to write it down. If this is a question you find as compelling as we do, and you would like to join us on this investigation, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what you're doing. We read everyone. So, if the past is a broken archive, how do we even begin to read the fragments that remain? How do we separate a real clue from a fantasy, without dismissing the mystery itself? The question we're left with is not a simple one. If the archive of the past is broken, if pages have been burned by catastrophe, torn out by time and submerged by water, how do we read what's left? How do we move forward without either inventing fantasy from the gaps or cynically dismissing every echo of a deeper story? To do that, we need a map. A clear set of rules for our investigation. Think of it like a detective arriving at a cold case. The first job is to separate the hard evidence from the old rumours, the eyewitness accounts from the local legends. We're going to do the same. For any piece of evidence we look at, a clay tablet, a stone circle, a footprint in the mud, we will sort it into distinct layers. First, there is the source layer. This is the ground floor. What does the object itself say? What can be measured? What is the direct, verifiable evidence? This is our anchor. Above that is the pattern layer. When we see similar stories, symbols, or building styles in different times and places, that's a pattern. It's not proof that they are connected, but it's real, and it asks a question. Then there is the belief-based layer. This is where we acknowledge how people, both ancient and modern, have interpreted these sources and patterns. This is where traditions of ancient teachers, of gods who brought knowledge from the sky, or of a lost golden age belong. We will treat these beliefs as important cultural artifacts in their own right, without pretending they are the same as the source layer. And finally, surrounding it all is the cautious boundary. This is where we state clearly what the evidence does not prove. This boundary is not here to kill the mystery, it's here to protect it. A real mystery is powerful. It doesn't need fake certainty or exaggerated claims to survive. In fact, those things are what make it brittle. The goal here is not to arrive at a simple final answer that closes the book on the past. The goal is to learn how to ask a better, deeper question. So with that map in hand, we can begin. We will start our journey at the largest possible scale, with an event so powerful it proves that the planet itself can hit reset, erasing an entire world from the Book of Life. To test the idea of planetary erasure, we have to begin long before any human memory. We start with a scar. It's buried now, hidden under kilometers of younger rock and the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. It's called the Chicxulub crater, a wound in the Earth's crust more than 180 kilometers wide. This is not a human story. It is the proof of concept. Think of it like a planet's hard reset. 66 million years ago, a world dominated by creatures for over 150 million years, a reign of permanence we can barely imagine, was brought to a sudden, violent end. The impact sent a shockwave of extinction across the globe. The sky darkened with dust and aerosols, blocking the sun for months, perhaps years. Photosynthesis failed. Food chains collapsed from the bottom up. In the end, around 75% of all species on Earth were wiped from the archive of life. The KPG boundary, a thin layer of sediment found all over the world, is the scar left in the geological book, the final page of one world and the blank first page of the next. This event is crucial to our investigation for one reason, and it has nothing to do with dinosaurs. It proves that the Earth's systems are capable of deleting a dominant order so completely that the world that comes after looks almost nothing like the world that came before. The lesson from that buried crater is not simply that powerful creatures can die, it's that what seems permanent can be removed so thoroughly that its reign becomes a ghost story told in stone. The planet itself is the first and most powerful archive filter. It can and does erase worlds. So what happens when a similar sky-darkening catastrophe strikes not long before humanity, but right in the middle of its story? The hard reset of the Chicxulub impact proves the planet can erase a world. But that happened long before our story began. What happens when a similar force is unleashed in the age of humans? We turn from a scar buried under the Yucatan to a vast lake in Sumatra, Indonesia. About 74,000 years ago, the volcano beneath what is now Lake Toba produced one of the largest known eruptions in Earth's history. It wasn't just a mountain blowing its top, it was a planetary event. It ejected so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that it created a volcanic winter, a dimming of the sun that may have lasted for years, causing global temperatures to drop. A thin, telltale layer of Toba's ash can still be found in sediments from the South China Sea to the Arabian Sea, a faint fingerprint of a time the sky itself was poisoned. For a long time, the story of Toba's effect on humanity was a simple and terrifying one. It was presented as the ultimate genetic bottleneck. The theory was that the volcanic winter caused such a catastrophic collapse of ecosystems that the total human population was reduced to perhaps only a few thousand individuals, a group small enough to fit in a modern concert hall. In this reading, every person alive today is a descendant of this tiny, desperate band of survivors who made it through the long winter. It's a powerful story of near extinction. But the ground itself is beginning to tell a more complicated story. Think of a vast wildfire that sweeps across a mountain range. From a distance, it looks like total devastation. But deep in a protected coastal canyon, one valley might be spared, its ecosystem and its inhabitants surviving the crisis. This is the idea of a survival pocket. While the idea of a severe global bottleneck is powerful, it's now a subject of intense scientific debate. In places like southern Africa, archaeologists have dug through the layers of time, and when they reach the faint deposit of Toba's ash, they find something surprising: continuity. The sophisticated stone tools people were making before the ash layer are often the same kind of tools they were making after. There is no dramatic break in culture, no sign of a total population collapse. It seems that for some groups, in some places, life went on. This doesn't mean the Toba eruption was not a catastrophe. It simply means its effects may have been uneven. The most important question then shifts. It's not just how many people died, but who survived and where. The real story may not be of one single group of ancestors, but of multiple survival pockets scattered across the globe, each holding on, each carrying a different set of skills and memories through the darkness. A catastrophe, then, is not a simple filter that lets only the strongest pass through. It's a complex one, creating a fragmented world of survivors, ghosts and stories that were never reconnected. We've considered fire from within the earth and a rock from the sky. But there is another eraser, one that is slower, quieter, and may have hidden more of the human story than any other: water. The ash from a supervolcano is not the only force that can erase a world. A much quieter, more relentless eraser has been at work for more than 12,000 years. It doesn't leave a layer of dust in the rock, it simply removes the rock itself from our view. Imagine watching a map of the world, but over the span of your own lifetime you see the oceans begin to creep inland, not with a single tidal wave, but with a slow, unstoppable rise, swallowing the coasts where you once lived. For the people who survived the end of the last ice age, this wasn't an academic exercise, it was their reality. The great ice sheets, miles thick in places, were melting. All of that locked up water had to go somewhere. It poured into the oceans and the oceans rose. This process was supercharged during a period of wild climate instability, known to scientists as the Younger Dryas. It was a time of climate whiplash, a sudden shocking return to near glacial cold, followed by an even more abrupt warming that accelerated the melt. In a few short centuries, sea levels could jump dramatically. Landscapes that had been coastal plains for thousands of years became the new continental shelf. And this reveals a profound problem at the heart of our search for the past. Where would you choose to live during an ice age? In the barren, frozen interior of a continent? Or would you live on the coasts, where rivers met the sea, where marine life was abundant, and where the climate was milder? The answer is obvious. The places most likely to support vibrant human communities are the very same places that were systematically erased from the map. This turns our entire understanding of the ancient past on its head. The apparent emptiness of our archaeological record in certain coastal areas might not be evidence of absence. It could be a profound preservation bias. We may have been searching for a library that flooded thousands of years ago, and then wondering why we can only find the books that were stored on higher ground. The archive filter in this case is not fire from the sky. It is the slow, patient, and irreversible rise of the water. So if the water erased the most likely homelands, what traces could possibly survive? What did the people who walked those lost landscapes leave behind? Deep in the American Southwest, in a place that was once the muddy shore of a long-vanished Ice Age lake, we found one, a single human footprint. In a dry lake bed in New Mexico, something survived the long filter of time. It isn't a stone tool or a monument. It's the simple, unmistakable shape of a human foot, pressed into mud at the height of the last Ice Age. This single footprint and the trackways that follow have been dated to between 21 and 23,000 years ago. To understand the weight of that number, it helps to imagine the story of the Americas as a book. For a long time, we were told the first pages were written about 13,000 years ago. These footprints are like finding a clear signature on a page we were told was blank. This is what archaeologists call a pre-Clovis site, a trace of human life that pushes the timeline back thousands of years. And it isn't alone. In Florida, submerged in the Orcilla River, the Page Ladson site shows human activity from over 14,500 years ago. These finds are quiet, but they are revolutionary. They are not proof of cities or empires. They are proof of people. They prove that a human story, an indigenous American story, was unfolding on this continent far, far earlier than we once knew. This doesn't just add a new chapter to the story of this land. It forces us to reconsider the beginning of the book. The idea of a vast empty continent waiting for history to begin is a fantasy. It was never empty. It was a homeland, filled with movement, awareness, and survival, for a span of time so deep it is difficult to comprehend. The immense scale of our investigation suddenly becomes local, tangible, and deeply human. The past is not just in distant deserts, it is under the soil of familiar places. A footprint is a physical memory, preserved by the chance encounter of mud and water. But what about cultural memory? If real water could hide whole landscapes, how did ancient people remember its power? Not in mud, but in story. In a quiet room in the British Museum, there's a fragment of baked clay. It is broken, scarred by time, and covered in the wedge-shaped marks of a language that has been silent for millennia. This is the Flood Tablet, a piece of the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is not a geological report or a scientific instrument. It is something both more fragile and more durable, a memory, fired into stone. How do we read a memory like this? It helps to think of a myth not as a simple true or false statement, but as a kind of container, designed to carry the shape of an event across generations. Think of a story your own family tells about a hardship or a great journey. Over the years, The exact words might change, some details might be sharpened and others lost, but the core lesson, the emotional truth of the event that survives. The story preserves the wound, the warning, or the triumph. It becomes a piece of cultural memory. The story on this clay tablet is one of the most powerful memories ever recorded. It tells of a man named Utnapishtim, who is warned by a compassionate god that the other gods have decided to destroy the world with a great flood. He is given instructions to build a massive boat, to seal it with pitch and bitumen, and to bring aboard the seed of all living things. The storm comes, a terrifying darkness that turns the world to water. For 6 days and 7 nights, the deluge rages. When it finally calms, Utnapishtim looks out from his vessel and sees only silence and water. The world he knew, the entire human project, has been washed away. Now, the source text itself tells this powerful story of survival and reset. A cautious reading, however, separates this profound literary tradition from a geological claim about a single, worldwide flood. The tablet is not a field report from the bottom of an ocean. It is something else. The real mystery here is not simply whether the story is literally true, but why this pattern is so persistent. Why did this culture and so many others feel the need to place a great world-ending flood at a critical point in their memory? It acts as a scar in their timeline, a fundamental boundary. This is where the story turns from a simple myth into a clue. Water, in these traditions, becomes the ultimate dividing line between a lost world before and the familiar world after. It is the mechanism that scrubs the archive clean. But what if a culture didn't just tell a story about a flood? What if they wrote a formal list of their kings, a history of their world, and the flood was a line item, written right in the middle of it? The story of the flood, baked into the clay of Gilgamesh, is a memory of survival. But another piece of clay from the same landscape preserves something stranger. It's not a story, but a list. A 4-sided prism, now in a quiet museum, inscribed with the names of kings. It's called the Well-Blundell Prism, and it contains one of the oldest historical documents we have. And according to this text, one of the very first kings of humanity, a ruler named Alulim, reigned for 28,800 years. This number feels impossible, a mistake, or a deliberate fiction. But what if it's neither? We do something similar today. We might speak of the Victorian era. That phrase doesn't mean Queen Victoria lived for a century of industrial change, but her name contains that entire world. The number, perhaps, is a container for a different kind of time. The prism lays out a precise structure. First, it says, kingship descended from heaven. It then lists 8 kings across 5 cities who ruled before a great catastrophe. Their reigns are all immense, measured in thousands of years. Then comes the dividing line. Just 4 words in the original Sumerian. The flood swept over. After that line, the list begins again. Kingship once more descends from heaven, but now the reigns are shorter. Still long, but closer and closer to a human lifetime. We are not claiming that ancient men lived for 28,000 years. That is not the point. The point is that one of humanity's oldest records insists, with mathematical precision, on a cataclysmic break in history. A before and an after. The truly profound mystery isn't just the long reigns themselves, but the fact that the scribes chose to preserve this impossible, broken timeline. They could have smoothed the numbers, made them more believable. They didn't. They carefully copied the impossibility. Why? What was the memory of the time before like, that only these fantastic numbers could describe it? This clay prism isn't just a list of kings, it is a monument to a memory of a profound rupture, a divide so deep that it fractured their very conception of time. This object remembers a world before a great reset. But what kind of memory could exist before writing itself? For that, we have to look not at clay, but at stone. The baked clay of Mesopotamia can preserve a memory of a world split in 2 by water. But what about memory preserved in stone, from a time so deep it precedes even the idea of a city? On a high ridge in southeastern Anatolia, a discovery was made that doesn't just add a new chapter to our story, it forces us to rethink the order of the book itself. The site is called Göbekli Tepe. It is a complex of massive circular stone enclosures built around 11,600 years ago. They were constructed by people who had no pottery, no metal tools, and had not yet domesticated animals or plants. To understand how profound this is, imagine finding a grand cathedral from a time when we believed people were only living in small scattered family groups. That is the scale of the shock. We are looking at rings of T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing nearly 20 feet tall and weighing many tons. They were quarried, moved, and raised with immense effort, all by communities of hunter-gatherers. This wasn't a shelter. It was a project, a gathering place of profound importance, built and rebuilt over generations. This doesn't prove a lost high-tech global empire. What it proves is that the people of the last ice age were far more complex, more organized, and driven by something much deeper than day-to-day survival. For decades, the standard model of civilization was a simple ladder. First, humans invent farming. Farming creates surplus food, which allows for permanent villages. Villages grow into cities, and only then, with the organization of a city, can people build monumental temples. But Göbekli Tepe turns that ladder on its head. What if the story is backwards? What if the intense shared need to build a sacred place came first? What if the act of gathering year after year to carve and raise these stones is what pushed people to invent new ways of living, new ways of feeding the crowds? Perhaps the temple came before the town. The neat straight line of progress from wildness to civilization dissolves here. It suggests that a shared sense of meaning, a sacred purpose, might not be a luxury of settled life, but one of its primary engines. The past becomes more complicated and far more interesting. But these pillars are not blank stone. They are covered in a silent language of images. So what were these people trying to remember so long before writing was ever invented? Look closer at the stone bodies of Göbekli Tepe. They are not blank. They are covered in a silent menagerie of wild animals, carved with an unnerving precision. A fox slips between the pillars, a wild boar charges, cranes stand in profile, and snakes writhe across the surface. These are not simple decorations. In a world without writing, symbols and places are the most durable forms of memory. This was a library made not of paper, but of landscape and stone, where every animal might be a character, and every enclosure a chapter in a story we can no longer read. What was this story about? What brought people back to this same hill for over 1,000 years? One interpretation sees it as a great ritual centre, a cathedral of the Stone Age. Dispersed bands of hunter-gatherers might have made long pilgrimages here, meeting to trade, to find partners, and to renew their bonds by working on a shared sacred project. Another reading sees the enclosures as a celestial observatory, a complex calendar tracking the movement of stars and constellations, mapping the rhythms of the sky to give order to life on Earth. And a third, more haunting possibility is that Göbekli Tepe is a monument to a catastrophe. Some researchers have suggested that the symbols might record a devastating comet impact, perhaps connected to the Younger Dryas climate shock. While this reading is debated, a cautious view can still see the site as an immense human response to a world in crisis, an attempt to build a permanent, orderly space in a time of terrifying change. The true meaning of each symbol may be lost to us, but the pattern of immense, coordinated and sustained effort is undeniable. This place acted like a cultural hard drive. It was a central node where the identity, history and sacred knowledge of a people were stored and performed. It wasn't a city, a place of daily production. It seems to have been a place of cultural reproduction, a centre for renewing the very idea of who we are. Perhaps it was the gravity of a place like this that created a coherent culture in the first place, pulling scattered people into a shared orbit of meaning. And this changes our understanding of complexity itself. The old ladder said that first you get farming, then villages, then cities and kings, and only then do you get the luxury of building massive temples. But Göbekli Tepe flips the script. It suggests that the project of building a shared symbolic world isn't a luxury of civilization. It's one of the engines that creates it. The need for meaning is as powerful a driver as the need for food. This impulse, for hunter-gatherer communities to organize on a vast scale to shape a sacred landscape, was not a one-time event, isolated to ancient Anatolia. Thousands of years later, and an ocean away, another group of people would also move the earth to create a place of meaning. This time, not with carved stone, but with soil. To see their world, we have to cross the Atlantic and travel to the wetlands of modern-day Louisiana. In the ancient forests and wetlands of what is now northern Louisiana, the Earth itself holds a memory. Seen from above, it's a geometric marvel, 6 enormous concentric half-rings of raised earth rippling outward from a central plaza, punctuated by 5 large mounds. This is Poverty Point. And it asks a profound question about the deep history of America. To stand here is to feel the weight of immense, coordinated labour. This landscape wasn't shaped by machines or draft animals. It was built by people, over generations, one basket of dirt at a time. The volume of earth moved is staggering, enough to fill hundreds of thousands of dump trucks. It is a monument built from the ground it stands on, a testament to a shared vision that endured for centuries. And it was built between 3,700 and 3,100 years ago, long before the great cities of Mesoamerica rose to prominence. The builders were not settled agriculturalists in the way we usually imagine. They were a sophisticated society of hunter-fisher-gatherers, sustained by the incredible natural abundance of the lower Mississippi Valley. Let's be absolutely clear on this point. This is not the work of a lost race or visitors from elsewhere. This is a profound achievement of the indigenous people of North America. It is a masterpiece of engineering, of social organization, and of a sacred vision made manifest in the landscape itself. It's evidence of a society that could command loyalty, organize complex projects, and sustain a population large enough to build on a monumental scale, all without the economic engine of full-scale agriculture, and that is the turn that changes our understanding. Like Göbekli Tepe, Poverty Point challenges the simple, linear story of human progress. It proves there are multiple paths to complexity. The old model, that people must first invent farming to create the food surplus needed to support monument builders, is not a universal law. Here, a different kind of wealth, the natural productivity of the rivers and forests, fueled a different kind of civilization. Evidence shows they were also at the centre of a vast trade network, with stones and minerals found here that originated hundreds, even thousands of miles away. This was not an isolated project. It was a connected, powerful hub. The deep time of America, then, is not just a few scattered footprints in ancient mud. It is written in these massive, organized and enduring landscapes of meaning. It tells us that for thousands of years before European contact, this continent was home to sophisticated cultural experiments, grand social projects, and a human story far deeper and more complex than many were ever taught. And this was not an endpoint. Further north, along that same great river, a gathering place would grow into something else, entirely. A true city, the largest north of Mexico. From the earthworks of Poverty Point, we move forward in time and expand in scale. Near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, another world of Earth rose into the sky. This was Cahokia. At its peak around the year 1100 CE, it was a city larger than London was at the time, with a population of tens of thousands. At its heart stood a structure still known as Monk's Mound, a colossal earthen platform with a base larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was the centre of a bustling, complex urban landscape, built by the indigenous people of the Mississippian culture. But complexity doesn't always look like a dense city. Hundreds of miles to the southwest, in what is now New Mexico, a different kind of order took shape in Chaco Canyon. Here, the ancestral Puebloan people built monumental stone structures known as great houses. But the true marvel wasn't just the buildings, it was the network that connected them. Hundreds of miles of engineered roads, some up to 30 feet wide, radiated out from the canyon. These weren't simple footpaths for trade. They were wide, straight avenues connecting dozens of outlying communities to the canyon's ceremonial heart, like a nervous system carrying ritual and meaning across a sacred landscape. These two worlds, the bustling Mississippian city of Cahokia and the networked Puebloan system of Chaco, are not myths. They are distinct, powerful examples of indigenous American achievement, written into the continent in earth and stone. And here, the old picture of the American past begins to dissolve. The story was never about a vast untouched wilderness waiting for history to begin. It was a continent of cities, of networks, of sophisticated astronomy, and of complex societies that rose, flourished, and fell long before European ships ever touched its shores. The question shifts. It's no longer, was there complexity in ancient America? The real question is, what kind of complexity was there, and what can its cycles of growth and decline teach us? The ground beneath us is not an empty stage. It is a deeply historical landscape, home to a human story as rich, as dynamic, and as fragile as any other on Earth. We see here not a static world, but a place of constant change, of power concentrating and dissolving, of memory being built into the very soil. And these great centres also declined. Their plazas grew quiet, their great houses emptied. Which brings us to a universal question. It is hard to build a complex world, but sometimes it is surprisingly easy for one to fall apart. So far in our journey, we have seen worlds built from earth and stone, organised by shared meaning and connected by networks of roads and rivers. But what happens when the network itself becomes the point of failure? Imagine a bronze workshop around 1200 BCE. The smith's entire craft, his world's technology, depends on a delicate recipe: 9 parts copper, 1 part tin. The copper might be local, but the tin comes from a long way away, across dangerous seas and foreign lands. And one day the ships carrying that tin simply stop arriving. This is how a complex world can end. Not always in a single, fiery blast, but with a crucial link in a long chain snapping. The great civilizations of the late Bronze Age, the Hittites in Anatolia, the Mycenaeans in Greece, the great powers of the Levant, were not isolated kingdoms. They were part of an interconnected system, the First International Age. Think of it like a modern electrical grid. One failed substation can overload the next, which trips another, cascading until an entire region goes dark. This ancient world was a grid built of sea lanes, diplomatic letters, and shared reliance on metals. And around this time, multiple parts of that grid began to fail. A period of severe and prolonged drought, visible in pollen and lakebed records, stressed the agricultural heartlands. This squeezed the palace economies, the centralised storehouses that fed armies and bureaucrats. The vital trade routes that carried tin and copper grew perilous. And into this volatile system came widespread migrations and conflict, including groups the Egyptians famously recorded as the Sea Peoples. Historians debate the exact mix of causes, but most agree that this wasn't one single event, but a chain reaction. A perfect storm where crop failure, political instability, and warfare amplified each other. Here is the unsettling turn. The very interconnectedness that made this world so prosperous was also what made it so brittle. Its greatest strength was its deepest vulnerability. These kingdoms were so specialized, so efficient, and so dependent on each other that when one major partner fell, the shockwave threatened to bring them all down. This reveals a different kind of apocalypse. Not a sudden reset from the heavens, but a slow, grinding unraveling from within. The collapse of a system can be a catastrophe of 1,000 small cuts, a failed harvest, a pirated ship, a broken treaty, until the entire structure gives way. So, what happens after the palaces burn and the trade routes go silent? What is left for the survivors to remember when the world that explained their lives is gone? When the palaces burned, the fire that destroyed them also baked their clay archives, preserving them by accident. But the minds that could read those archives were gone. A script like Linear B, the administrative language of the Mycenaean world, simply vanished from human use for over 3,000 years. It became a collection of marks without meaning, a voice without a mouth. This is what systemic collapse looks like. It's like losing the operating system for a society. The hardware, the people, the fields, the rivers, the stone quarries might all still be there. But the complex software that ran on top of it all, the code of literacy, administration, and long-distance trade, has been wiped clean. The world shrinks. The great roads become paths. The port that once welcomed ships from a dozen kingdoms now only serves local fishing boats. The knowledge of how to build a chariot, or navigate by a specific star, or manage a grain surplus for a city of thousands simply evaporates. This wasn't the end of people, but it was the end of their world. In the centuries that followed, communities became smaller, more isolated. The material record changes profoundly. The intricate painted pottery is replaced by simpler, local styles. The flow of copper and tin stops, and with it, the flow of ideas and influence. A deep fracture appears in the memory of the world. And this is the turn. This is how history becomes myth. The generations that come after inherit a landscape of fragments. They live among the ruins of giant walls they cannot explain. They tell stories about a time when great kings commanded vast fleets, but the context that made those kings real historical figures is gone. A Bronze Age warlord, a man like Agamemnon, becomes a character in an epic poem, his world transformed from a political reality into a heroic half-remembered dream. Collapse, then, is a powerful filter for memory. It doesn't just destroy things, it destroys the connections between things. It erases the instruction manual and leaves future generations with a complex machine they no longer know how to operate. The Late Bronze Age collapse was a failure of human systems, a complex cascade of drought, migration, and conflict. But what happens when the system of nature itself seems to break? What happens when the sun, for a year, no longer brings warmth? In the year 536 CE, a historian in Constantinople named Procopius looked at the sky and wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, and it seemed as if the sun was in a constant eclipse. For more than a year, a strange dry fog, a mysterious veil of dust dimmed the skies from Europe to the Middle East. Summer temperatures dropped. Snow fell in August. In Ireland, the chronicles record a failure of bread. In China, a yellow dust that fell like snow. It was a catastrophe people could see and feel but could not explain. Their accounts are fragments of a global crisis, the testimony of witnesses to a crime without a culprit. But in a cold case this old, you have to look for other kinds of witnesses, not just human chroniclers, but witnesses that are silent, patient, and incapable of lying, the trees and the ice. A living tree is a notebook of time. Every year it writes a new sentence about its life in the form of a growth ring. A good year, with plenty of sun and rain, produces a wide, healthy ring. A bad year, a cold, short summer, leaves behind a thin, starved, constricted line. And when scientists looked at the wood from that time, from Irish oaks to bristlecone pines in North America, they saw it. The rings for the years following 536 CE are exceptionally thin, some of the narrowest in thousands of years. The trees were remembering the cold. Far away in the glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica, another archive was being kept. Each year's snowfall buries and compresses the last, trapping tiny bubbles of air and particles of dust. Drilling deep into this ice is like pulling a library of the ancient atmosphere to the surface, and in the layers corresponding to those same years, scientists found a dense concentration of microscopic volcanic glass and sulfates, the chemical signature of a colossal volcanic eruption somewhere on Earth. While the exact volcano is still debated, the evidence converges on one conclusion. A massive eruption, or perhaps a series of them, had thrown an enormous volume of dust and sulfuric acid into the upper atmosphere, creating a veil that reflected sunlight back into space and plunged the northern hemisphere into a volcanic winter. For the first time in our investigation, two completely independent archives tell the exact same story. The panicked words of a human historian are confirmed by the silent testimony of a tree's stunted growth and a layer of acidic dust locked deep in polar ice. The human record and the planetary record align perfectly. The archive of the past, we are learning, is not only written in stone and clay, it is written in the memory of living things and preserved in the chemistry of the Earth itself. The planet remembers what human societies could only experience as a terrifying and incomprehensible darkness, and the world that emerged from under that veil was colder, hungrier, and profoundly weakened. It had become the perfect environment for another kind of apocalypse to spread, one that would move not just through the sky, but through the veins of the living. The crisis we just saw in the year 536 CE came from the sky, dimming the sun and chilling the earth. But another kind of catastrophe moves on a different path. It doesn't break trade networks or darken the sky. It moves from person to person, rewriting the human world from within. In the middle of the 14th century, the Black Death arrived in Europe, and in a handful of years it left a silence that could be felt across the continent. This wasn't a crisis of failed crops or broken palaces, it was a crisis of absence. Fields stood ready for harvest with no one to bring it in. Workshops were full of tools, but the hands that knew how to use them were gone. It is difficult to comprehend the scale of the loss, but the consequence was simple and inescapable. When a third to a half of the population vanishes, the value of those who remain changes completely. Suddenly, there were far fewer workers, but the same land needed to be farmed, the same goods needed to be made. The value of a single pair of hands went up. For the first time in centuries, peasants and labourers had leverage. They could demand higher wages. They could move to find better work. The rigid bonds of the old feudal order, which had seemed permanent, began to fray, not because of a revolution, but because of a plague. It is easy to look back across centuries and see these changes as a kind of progress, a necessary shock that broke open a rigid world and paved the way for a new one. But this is a dangerous illusion. It ignores the cost. This was not an engine of progress. It was an engine of grief. Society was not improved. It was hollowed out, and into that empty space new structures began to grow, shaped by the memory of loss. The true turn is this. History is not only shaped by what is present, by armies and kings and inventions. It can be shaped even more powerfully by what is absent. The immense silent pressure of the millions who were gone did more to change the balance of power than any rebellion. The structure of the world was altered not by a new idea, but by a great and terrible emptiness. The Black Death shows us that a reset doesn't have to be geological or cosmic. A catastrophe can be biological, rewriting the social DNA of a civilization by removing its people. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound changes are driven by what is no longer there. We have now followed the traces left by crater and ash, by rising water and broken networks, by a dimmed sun and a devastating plague. It's time to pull the camera back, to look at these fragments together and to ask, what is the single, powerful pattern that connects them all? We have followed the traces, a scar of impact under the Gulf of Mexico, a horizon of ash from a volcano that darkened the sky, a shoreline that moved relentlessly inland, swallowing the human map, a single footprint pressed into Ice Age mud, a clay prism that counts time in impossible numbers, a circle of stone raised by hands that left no other name, and an earthen mound shaped into a sacred landscape. Each is a survivor, each is a clue. But they are not clues to a single story. They are fragments left behind by the same process. We have been taught to think of history as a book we are slowly learning to read. But what if it isn't a book? What if it's the surviving pages of a library that has been through a fire? What we see, what we call the past, is not the whole story. It is only the survivor surface, and the fire, the flood, the forgetting, that is the archive filter. Each catastrophe we've examined acts as a different kind of filter, selectively destroying the record. The Great Impact and the supervolcano were a biological filter, removing the dominant actors from the world and leaving an archive of bone that suggests a planet suddenly emptied. The rising seas were a geographical filter, systematically erasing the coastlines where humanity likely thrived, biasing the entire archaeological record toward the interior. The footprint, the stone pillars, the earthen ridges are survivors of a material filter. They tell us about mud, stone, and earth, because the worlds of wood, fibre, song, and skin that surrounded them have been erased by the simple filter of decay. And the clay tablets, with their flood stories and strange kings, they are survivors of a cultural filter. A scribe chose to copy that story, to preserve that list, while 1,000 other memories were left on perishable material and vanished. Finally, the collapse of a great network, the dimming of the sun, the arrival of a plague. These are systemic filters. They don't just burn the library, they erase the knowledge of how to read the surviving pages. They destroy context, turning a connected world into a collection of curiosities. This framework is a powerful way to ask questions, not a machine for generating easy answers. It doesn't prove that any one lost empire existed exactly as told in a myth, but it proves that the conditions for their complete disappearance are real and recurring. The archive is constantly being filtered. So perhaps the most profound implication is this. What we call the beginning of history, the rise of the first cities in Mesopotamia and Egypt, might not be the beginning of human complexity. It might simply be the beginning of the first human complexity that built an archive durable enough to survive the filters. It's not that history starts with Sumer, it's that the surviving record starts with Sumerian clay. All the chapters before that are mostly lost. This is the pattern the traces leave behind. Not a story of inevitable progress rising from the ashes, but a more humbling and unsettling one. A story of survival, of fragments, of broken inheritance. History is what loss allows to remain. And this idea of a survivor surface feels ancient, a problem for people who lived thousands of years ago. But how fragile is our own? What will our civilization look like when it becomes the next layer in the archive? Imagine a building that does not look like a building. It has no windows, no grand entrance. It is a vast humming container, a modern temple where our civilization stores its memory. Inside, cool air moves through endless aisles of servers, their blinking lights a silent conversation between machines. This is where our photographs, our books, our records, our entire collective knowledge lives as electrical charge and magnetic alignment. Now, imagine the same building after a few generations without power. The humming stops, the lights go out. It is just a silent warehouse full of metal boxes. A future archaeologist who finds one of our hard drives holds a locked diary without a key. And the key is not just a password. The key is our entire global power grid. It is the factory that can build a machine to read the disk. It is the operating system that can understand the file system and the specific software that can decode the file format. Without this entire chain of fragile context, our library of everything becomes a collection of useless bricks. A clay tablet, baked in the Mesopotamian sun 4,000 years ago, is its own hardware and software. It needs only light and a human eye. It can be dropped, buried, forgotten and rediscovered. And its message remains. A story carved into a stone pillar at Göbekli Tepe survives 10,000 years of weather. Will the data on your phone survive for 10? Our greatest strength, the ability to create and store near infinite information, is tied to our greatest fragility. We have built a memory palace of ghosts. The turn is that future people might find our world harder to read than ancient Sumer. They may find the skeletons of our cities, the strange plastic geology we are leaving in the soil, the ruins of our dams and highways. They will see evidence of immense power and organization. But without the software of our civilization, they would be left with objects they cannot operate and a world of data they cannot access. Our time could become a myth, a story of a people who could speak to anyone in the world in an instant and hold libraries in their hands, but who built their memory on a whisper of electricity. This is not a prediction. It is a mirror. It makes the loss of ancient memory feel immediate and personal. It gives us a deep, unsettling empathy for a world that has passed through a filter of collapse. We can finally understand how a complex reality, full of knowledge and life, can become a few confusing, durable traces. And if our own world of machines and networks could become a story about magic, then how should we listen to ancient stories that sound like just that? Stories of knowledge that did not grow from the ground up but was handed down, a fragile inheritance from a world before. We saw how our own civilization, stripped of its context, could become a myth. With that in mind, we can return to the ancient world with new eyes and listen again to one of its most powerful and unsettling claims. Remember the phrase from the Sumerian King List? After the flood, it says, "Kingship once again descended from heaven." It's a strange line, but it's part of a much larger global pattern. These are not just stories of kings, but stories about the origin of order itself. Many ancient cultures preserve a memory of a time before the arts of civilization were known, followed by the arrival of a teacher, a lawgiver, a bringer of knowledge. In Mesopotamia, traditions speak of beings like Oans, who emerged from the sea to teach humanity writing, agriculture, and architecture. This pattern of instruction from a non-human source is one of the most persistent in the ancient record. It's a motif that appears in many forms, sometimes as gods, sometimes as sky beings, sometimes as culture heroes. In a belief-based reading, this pattern can be interpreted as a fragmented memory of a real intervention, pointing to figures like the Anunnaki or the Watchers as bringers of knowledge. This is where our method becomes essential. The source layer is clear. The texts themselves record these stories of knowledge being given. A belief-based reading keeps the door open to a literal interpretation. But a more cautious reading sees a powerful metaphor at work. Civilization feels so miraculous, so transformative, that it must have come from outside the normal course of human life. It's a way of giving sacred authority to the very foundations of society. But this brings us to the turn. The most powerful question is not whether these stories are literally true reports of ancient visitors. The deeper mystery is why this pattern is so common. Why did so many cultures, separated by time and geography, remember their own civilization not as something they painstakingly invented, but as something they were given. They remembered it as an inheritance, a transmission of knowledge from a prior source. By holding these layers together, source, belief, and symbol, we don't solve the mystery, we protect it. We see it not as a simple claim to be proven or debunked, but as a profound piece of cultural memory. These are powerful stories. But if we were to take the possibility of a lost inheritance seriously, what kind of evidence would we need to look for beyond the stories themselves? So we arrive at the most important question. After exploring these powerful patterns in memory and story, what would it take to move the idea of a lost, deeper past from a fascinating possibility to a grounded probability? What kind of evidence would be strong enough? Imagine this investigation not as a collection of stories, but as a cold case presented in a courtroom. A single piece of circumstantial evidence, however compelling, rarely secures a conviction. You need corroborating witnesses, you need physical proof, you need multiple, independent lines of inquiry that all point in the same direction. We can think of this as an evidence ladder. On the lowest rung, we have isolated stories or myths. They are invaluable as starting points, as clues to what a culture feared or remembered. But by themselves, they aren't proof of a physical event. A step higher on the ladder, we find recurring patterns across many different unconnected cultures, similar stories of flood or of knowledge-bringing teachers. This is stronger. It suggests a shared memory or a common human response to a real type of trauma. It makes the question much bigger. Higher still, we find physical anomalies, places like Göbekli Tepe that don't fit the simple, linear model of the past. A site like that doesn't prove a global lost empire, but it proves that our previous, simpler story was incomplete. It's a heavy weight on the scale, and at the very top of the ladder, that would be the unambiguous physical trace. A sophisticated tool, a piece of clear technology, found locked in a geological layer that scientists agree is 20,000 years old. That would be the final highest rung. This ladder isn't meant to be a barrier, designed to make the mystery impossible to solve. It is a roadmap. It shows the path a real investigation must follow. And here is the crucial turn. Applying this kind of discipline doesn't kill the mystery. It makes it stronger. A question that can withstand scrutiny is far more powerful than a fragile belief that shatters at the first hard question. The search becomes more meaningful when you know precisely what you are looking for. With this toolkit, we are no longer just passive listeners to stories. We become active investigators, able to weigh the evidence for ourselves, to hold on to the vast sense of wonder while respecting the boundary of what is known. We can ask the big questions without needing to accept small answers. Armed with this evidence ladder, let's revisit the core idea of what these catastrophes do. There's a common story that says disaster creates progress, that it clears the way for something better. It's time to replace that idea with something more honest and far more powerful. There is a familiar, almost comforting story we are sometimes told about catastrophe. That disaster is an engine of progress. That collapse clears away the old and weak, making space for the new and strong. That the Black Death, in its horrifying sweep, somehow paved the way for a better world. But this is a dangerous and hollow comfort. It asks us to find a silver lining in a mass grave. A more human truth is much simpler. A house fire does not make a family stronger. It is a tragedy they are forced to survive. They don't rebuild from a clean slate better than before. They rebuild from the ashes, grieving what they lost, trying to salvage what few, precious things the fire did not consume. That is not progress. That is survival. What we have seen, from the Chicxulub crater to the drowned coastlines, from the broken networks of the Bronze Age to the fall of the sun in 536 CE, is not a clean cycle of destruction and rebirth. It is a story of immense loss, followed by a difficult, uneven inheritance. Survivors take up the fragments of the world that was. They carry forward a skill, a story, a seed, a root remembered in the landscape. They work with the ruins of what came before. This is not a grand renewal, it is a broken inheritance. We must be clear, framing mass death as a necessary price for a better future is a profound failure of respect for the dead. It turns unimaginable loss into an accounting error on the ledger of history. The truth is that catastrophe is, first and always, a tragedy. Civilization is not a phoenix. reborn from ashes, stronger and more glorious than before. It is far more like a refugee, escaping a burning city in the dark. It cannot carry the entire library, the whole palace, the complete map of its world. It can only carry a few precious heirlooms, a few tools, and the memory of what was lost. What comes next is not built from nothing. It is built from those fragments, haunted by the ghost of a world that is no more. This is the true shape of history, not a ladder of progress, but a long, difficult chain of inheritance, interrupted by fire and flood. So if survival is about what can be carried forward, a more urgent question emerges. What kinds of things are durable enough to be inherited across an apocalypse? What is memory actually made of? When a world breaks, what is left? It is rarely the most complex or beautiful thing. It is almost never the most fragile. What is left often is the simplest, the most durable. Fired clay, common earth, given a new life by fire. Memory has different containers. Some are like a detailed painting holding every shade of a forgotten world, but they are printed on paper, vulnerable to water and time. Others are like a single letter carved into rock. The detail is gone, but the mark itself remains. The clay tablet can hold a list of kings, a harvest record, a law, but it can shatter. The great stone pillar can hold a symbol, a warning to the sky, but it takes a generation's effort to raise, and it cannot be easily moved. The earthwork, the mound, the ridge, it can hold the shape of a gathering place for thousands of years, but it loses all the fine detail of the faces who met there. And then there is story, the most portable medium of all. It can cross any ocean, survive any winter, carried only in human breath. But it changes with every telling. It adapts, it forgets. Each medium saves something. Each one also loses something. What survives a deep forgetting, then, is not always what was most important to the world that was lost. It is simply what was entrusted to the most durable container. We don't just remember with our minds, we remember with our materials. So if these are the containers, the clay, the stone, the earth, the story, what is the most valuable message to place inside them? A skill passed from a parent to a child. How to read the clouds for rain. Which plants heal and which ones are poison. Which part of the river floods first. This is a different kind of inheritance, quieter than stone or gold, but perhaps more vital. It forces us to distinguish between two types of knowledge that can survive a reset: information and wisdom. Information is data. It tells you a tiger is a predator. Wisdom is a strategy. It tells you not to walk through a certain valley at dusk. Information can be stored in a library. Wisdom must be carried in a person, in a practice, in a story. When we look at the myths that survive for millennia, they are rarely simple data tables. They are saturated with wisdom. They are survival heuristics packaged in narratives that are easy to remember and repeat. They warn, do not build your city too close to the water. They caution, do not become so arrogant that you anger the forces of nature. They remember, there was a time of darkness, a long winter, a great flood, and this is how our ancestors made it through. This isn't about romanticizing a lost past. It is about recognizing the function of tradition as a form of survival technology, tested over generations. A story that saves a single life is more likely to be told again than a story that is merely interesting. And here, the purpose of these ancient memories can turn in our hands. Perhaps their primary function was never to be a perfect record of the past, but to be a useful program for the future. They are less like a history book, and more like a piece of warning software, installed in the minds of descendants to help them navigate a dangerous world. When seen this way, these stories are not failed science or flawed history. They are stunningly successful survival guides, coded into the most durable medium of all, human memory, ritual, and repetition. They are the collected wisdom of those who made it through. What matters is not whether the details are literally true, but that the warning itself is lethally real. If this is the kind of knowledge that endures, it leaves us with a profound question. What wisdom, not just what information, will our own civilization leave behind for those who come after? We have tried to read the traces of the ancient past. Now for a moment, let's imagine someone in the distant future trying to read ours. Imagine for a moment a future archaeologist. Their tools sift through a strange thin layer in the rock, a layer of plastic, concrete, and rust. They are digging through our world. They unearth a smartphone, a smooth dark rectangle of glass and polished metal. To them, it is a locked box, a beautiful but inert stone. They have no concept of the electricity that made it live, the networks that gave it a voice, or the global library of images and words it once held in its silent memory. It is an object of immense complexity whose meaning is completely lost. What would they make of our ruins? Would they see our vast, sprawling highways not as routes for commerce, but as sacred lines for immense religious processions? Would they interpret the ruins of a data center, a server farm with its silent stacked racks, as a temple to forgotten, silent gods? Would the logos and symbols we printed on everything, from cans to clothing, be read as magical sigils, their original purpose as brands utterly vanished? This isn't a prophecy, but an exercise in perspective. It's a way to feel, in our own time, the profound challenge of reading a broken past. Because in this thought experiment, we see the final turn of the cycle. We realize that we too will become a collection of mysterious fragments. Our own complex world, so full of urgent meaning to us now, will one day be a myth. We are the ancients of the future, and suddenly the creators of the Sumerian King List, or the builders of Göbekli Tepe, feel much closer. We develop a deep empathy for their world of fragments, because we see that our world is made of the same fragile stuff. This is the ultimate humility of history. We are just one more layer in the deep strata of time, a world that will one day be read by others through the few durable things we leave behind. Having looked into the distant future, let's turn one last time to the deepest and most erased layer of all, to the long story of humanity before the first clay tablet was ever fired. Before the fired clay, before the carved stone, there was a world made of other things, a world of wood shaped by hand and fire into homes and tools, a world of woven fibre, of animal hide stretched and cured for clothing and shelter, a world of knowledge carried not on tablets, but in the memory of an elder, a world of meaning passed through the rhythm of a song, the steps of a dance, the telling of a story around a fire. For most of the human journey, this was the entire archive. It was a library made of breath, sinew, and skill. It was rich, it was complex, and it was almost entirely perishable. The things that mattered most to the people who lived then, a well-told story, a useful plant, the memory of a safe passage, were the very things that leave no ghost in the rock. Trying to reconstruct this world from the few stone tools that survive is like trying to understand an ancient forest by studying a handful of petrified trees. We can see the stone wood, measure its rings, analyze its structure. We can admire its durability. But the fossil cannot tell us about the scent of the living leaves, the feel of the damp soil, the sound of the wind moving through the canopy. It cannot tell us about the ecosystem of insects and birds, the cycles of growth and decay, the life that pulsed through the undergrowth. The vast majority of what made the forest a living thing is simply gone, filtered out by time and chemistry. What remains is an echo, durable but incomplete. Our species has walked the earth for hundreds of thousands of years, yet the history we can read, the history of words and kingdoms and empires, is only a thin layer on the surface, perhaps the last 5,000 or 6,000 years. Before that lies an ocean of time so vast it is nearly impossible to comprehend. 97% of the human story, maybe more, unfolded in this deep quiet, leaving almost no written record. Generation after generation, for millennia, people lived full lives. They explored continents, they solved immense environmental challenges, they developed language, art, and complex societies. They were us, and their library burned with the setting of every sun, vanishing with the decay of every organic tool, fading with the last breath of every storyteller. The silence in the deep archive does not mean the ancient world was empty or simple. It only means it was built from materials that time consumes. This is the great preservation bias. It doesn't give us license to invent lost golden ages without evidence, but it does command our respect for the scale of what is missing. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is a testament to the power of a slow, quiet, and universal apocalypse, the simple process of decay. This is the catastrophe that is always happening. It is not a singular event like an asteroid or a supervolcano. It is a constant, grinding filter that has removed more of the human story than any flood or fire. The history we know is not the beginning of the story. It is the unlikely survivor, the tiny fraction of the past that happened to be recorded in a medium durable enough to outlast the great forgetting. This leaves us with a profound and necessary humility. We stand on a small island of recorded time, looking out at an ocean of what has been lost. The stone tools, the megaliths, the fragments of myth. These are not just curious relics. They are messages in a bottle. Washed ashore from a continent that has otherwise vanished beneath the waves of time. The greatest mystery is not what is in the texts we have found, but the scale of the library that we will never read. And so, after this long journey through the traces that survived, we arrive at the edge of what can be known. We have seen what catastrophe can do. The question remains, can we count the number of worlds that were lost? Perhaps not. But we can gather the threads one last time and arrive at a conclusion more powerful than any number. So what is the final pattern? It is not a simple cycle of destruction and rebirth. It is something quieter and more profound. The final pattern is one of filtration. Catastrophe and the simple passage of time act as a series of filters on the archive of the past. What we are left with is not the complete story. It is the survivor surface. Imagine a vast, ancient landscape of mountains and valleys, now flooded. We can only see the highest peaks that remain above the water. We can map those peaks with great precision, but the map of the peaks is not a map of the original world. It is only a map of what survived the flood. Our journey through geology, archaeology, and ancient texts has shown the same thing. A crater that reset the planet. A shoreline that moved across the map. A footprint in Ice Age mud. A clay tablet that remembers a world before a great flood. Each one is a peak, a survivor, telling a twin story of persistence and immense loss. This investigation has established with confidence that these filters are real forces. That is the firm ground we stand on. What remains open, and what must be approached with both disciplined curiosity and intellectual humility, is the precise nature of the world that was filtered, and so we arrive at the true purpose of our journey together. The goal was never to provide a neat count of vanished worlds. An archive this damaged cannot be forced to give up a clean number. The real goal was to earn a better question. We no longer have to ask only, what does the historical record say? We can now ask, what does the record not say, and why? The answer is not a number. The answer is a better way of listening to the silence, and with that question held in place, we can let the arguments fall away and return to the simple, durable things that brought us here. In the end, after all the noise of catastrophe has faded, what is left are the quietest things, a single footprint pressed into the mud of an Ice Age shore in New Mexico, the trace of a moment, a body moving through a world we can barely imagine. It is a record of life, uncomplicated and profound. It does not speak of kings or empires, it speaks only of presence, a prism of baked clay from a land between two rivers. Its faces are covered in the dense, careful marks of a scribe, recording a history that breaks in two, a world before a great flood and a world after. It is a record of rupture, a deliberate memory of a line drawn across time, and an earthen ridge in Louisiana, one of 6, built by the hands of a community who hunted and fished. A choice, made over generations to shape the ground into a form of shared meaning. It is a record of agreement, of a people gathering to create a place that would outlast them. These are the handles on deep time. They are not pieces of the same puzzle, they are pieces from different puzzles, all telling us that the story is larger and far older than the one we thought we knew. Their power is not that they provide a final answer. Their power is that they survived at all. A footprint, a prism, and a ridge. They do not solve the mystery of the past. They are the mystery. These traces remain through some combination of accident, material, and intention. They are what the great filter of time and catastrophe allowed to pass through. They survived. Which raises the final quiet question. What will we choose to preserve? Across this entire journey, through every trace and every catastrophe, a quiet human act persists. The choice to preserve something, the decision to tell a story, to carve a stone, to shape the earth, to bake a list of kings onto a clay prism. It is the simple, fundamental impulse to leave a record, a small anchor against the tide of forgetting. We are all, in our own way, leaving a legacy. We are writing a message to a future we will not see, for readers who may not speak our language or understand the world that surrounded our words. The question that echoes back from the past is not just what they chose to save, but what we, now, believe is worth saving for others. Perhaps the most important things to preserve are not our proudest achievements or our most complex technologies. Those things can be rebuilt. Perhaps the most durable legacy is the memory of our own fragility, a warning, a map of where the ground can give way. The real inheritance from a catastrophe is not the clean slate it creates, but the hard-won wisdom that no system is permanent, that the sky can change, that the water can rise. The people who survived these resets were not just carriers of skills, but carriers of caution. The story of a great flood is more than a memory of water. It is a piece of survival software, a warning passed down through generations that the world you know is not guaranteed to last forever. This might be the deepest meaning hidden in that strange Sumerian King List. The scribes who copied those impossible numbers were not making a mistake. They were preserving a rupture. They were choosing to write down the break in the timeline the moment the flood swept over. They could have edited it, smoothed it over, created a clean and logical history that made sense. But they didn't. They preserved the strangeness. It is possible they understood something profound, that the most important memory is the memory of the forgetting itself. The most vital piece of knowledge to pass on to the next world is that the old one can be washed away, and in that act a thread is woven. A thread of shared purpose that connects us, across thousands of years, to the person carving a symbol on a pillar at Göbekli Tepe, to the community moving baskets of earth at Poverty Point, to the scribe pressing a reed into wet clay. It is the human chain of memory. The act of looking back, of trying to understand the fragments, is our way of taking hold of that same thread. We become part of the same long story of survival, not by solving every mystery, but by honouring the act of remembering. This shared responsibility, to listen to the past and to preserve a careful record for the future, is what makes us more than just survivors. It makes us custodians of a story far larger than our own lives. And so we arrive at the final question. After this journey through impact and ash, through drowned coastlines and the memory of water, through impossible numbers baked in clay and cities built of earth, what is the final count? How many worlds, how many cycles of human organisation were erased before the one we can read? The only honest answer is that we cannot make that count. To invent a number now, to offer a neat tally of 3, or 5, or 10 forgotten ages, would be to betray the entire method of this investigation. It would be an act of fiction, not discovery. The evidence does not permit it. More importantly, the nature of the evidence forbids it. Think of it as finding a great library after a fire. 99% of the books are ash. Of the few that remain, most are charred with only a few legible pages. From those fragments, we can confirm that the library once existed. We can feel its scale. We can read a few surviving lines of poetry, a fragment of a law, a name from a king list. But we cannot use those fragments to count the exact number of books that were lost. To do so would be to mistake the survivors for the whole story. The archive of the deep past is that burned library, and our history is what we can read from the few pages that did not turn to smoke. What we can count are the forces of erasure. We have followed their tracks. We have seen the power of planetary impact, a force that can reset an entire biological stage. We have seen the power of volcanic winter, a force that darkens the sky and stresses the chain of life. We have seen the slow, relentless power of water, an ocean that rises over generations, swallowing the very landscapes where memory was made. We have felt the quiet power of decay, the slow apocalypse that consumes everything made of wood and fibre and skin and unrepeated story. And we have witnessed the power of systemic collapse, when the invisible connections that hold a world together simply break, leaving behind ruins without their operating manual. These filters are real. Their effects are visible. They are the reason the archive is broken. They are the reason the mystery is so profound. The strongest conclusion we can draw is not about what we have found, but about the shape of the record itself. The historical surface is real, but it is a survivor. It is what remained. And this changes the nature of our most fundamental questions. The purpose of this journey was not to arrive at a final number, a fixed destination on a map of the past. It was to learn a better way to travel through that landscape. It was to learn to see the empty spaces on the map not as proof of absence, but as questions waiting for a different kind of evidence. The goal was not to solve the mystery with a simple answer, but to understand why the mystery itself is so durable, so necessary. A disciplined mystery, one that respects the boundaries of evidence,